The category is What the Trans, darlings?
Well, hello, and a very warm welcome to this slightly festive episode of What the Trans.
What the Trans?
Yes, What the Trans, the otherwise untitled trans podcast. That's us. We do the news and we get snarky about it. How are you, Michelle?
I'm a little bit rushed off my feet, getting all of my ducks in a row for Christmas, and this is by far the earliest in the day we have ever recorded a show. We got up at 7 o'clock this morning to get this show done. We're actually recording on the day it comes out, which is new. This isn't going to be a regular thing. It's just how it shook out this week. And it's all a bit early, and I don't know how to function in the early times. How do you do mornings, Ashley? Because they are a massive problem for me.
Coffee, really? And many years of working like office type standard 8 to 4 or 9 to 5 jobs means that I am a fully trained worker drone now, and I'm A-OK getting up at 7 o'clock. So, that's delightful, isn't it? I know what you mean, though, about sort of having to run around to get all of your ducks in a row for Christmas. Now, part of the reason that we're recording this episode so very, very early is because you and I have got a bunch of stuff to do literally today. And that's in terms of sorting presents out and stuff. I am, as I might have mentioned and bitched about once or twice, I don't have a job, so I'm on universal credit, which means I don't have a great deal of money for Christmas presents, which means I am getting creative. I'm getting crafty with my Christmas presents, which I like doing, but it does take time. So, and I have to just sort of sit down and make some stuff this afternoon, and then I'm making dinner and friends are coming round and fun will be had. But, it's all good. So, yeah, but it's been a fun week in the news, hasn't it? Well, I say fun.
I mean,
interesting.
Yeah.
So, as we made mention of at the very start of the last episode when Michelle did a little drop-in, we recorded the last episode before we were completely fully aware of the result from the general election, which was last week. The polls were still open when we recorded the bulk of the episode. Obviously, later on that very evening, the exit polls confirmed all of our worst fears.
That made the edit so much harder. It really did. Just on one screen, the world was crumbling, and on the other screen, okay, I've got to sort out the equalization of this sound bit, but does it matter? Because the world is falling apart at the seams. Does sound equalization and normalization matter anymore in this new Boris hellscape we live in?
Well, quite. I mean, we still want to get our message out clearly and sarcastically. So obviously the edit covers one and the recording covers the other. So there's going to be several episodes, I suspect, devoted to the government, and we're going to have a nice conversation a little bit later on in the episode with somebody who knows a little bit more about it. But we are just going to get started on the basic news of the day and occasionally just remember that the Tories are in charge and get annoyed about it and start bitching about it again. So you'll have to forgive us for that. Let's get this started, shall we, with the story of Maya Forstater, JK Rowling, The Guardian, and why all of those people are bullshitting about what the Equality Act is. So, setting the scene, a few months ago, Maya Forstater held a crowdfunding campaign, the money from which she would use to take her old employer to an employment tribunal in the hopes of having her anti-trans views protected by the Equality Act. So earlier this year, Forstater was a researcher at the Centre for Global Development, a think tank which campaigns against poverty and against inequality, but her contract with them was not renewed, at least in part over Forstater tweeting incredibly transphobic stuff, and the Centre for Global Development deciding that actually they didn't want a bigot working at a social justice think tank. So sadly, but not surprisingly, the crowdfund was successful. She raised £70,000 thanks to support from all over anti-trans world, and she did exactly what she said she was going to do. She stated in May on social media that she had begun employment tribunal proceedings for discrimination. This will be a test case to establish that gender-critical views are protected beliefs under the Equality Act of 2010 as a philosophical belief. Now, the specific belief in question being that she believes that sex is immutable, and as such, she will refer to trans women as men, refer to them using he and him pronouns, and all that lovely stuff. So you will note that even if we accept that the belief that she claims is legitimate, the actions she undertakes as a result of this belief affect other people. This alleged philosophical belief is not a solo act when you're using it to justify awful behaviour towards other people, and we will come back to that. So this tribunal was held between the 13th and the 21st of November and could have resulted in a precedent of transphobia being a protected characteristic in the Equality Act, alongside sex, sexuality, race, gender identity, etc. But thankfully, it did not, and Judge James Taylor rejected the complaint. So in this judgment, which came out on the 19th of December, which you can read for yourself, the link is in the description, Taylor said that he did not agree with Forstater's argument that her anti-trans views qualify as a protected belief, and that there was significant evidence that suggested Forstater would refer to a person by the sex she considered appropriate, even if it violates their dignity and or creates an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. He went on to explain that this would be in conflict of the Equality Act as it applies to trans people, and that philosophical beliefs can only be covered in the Equality Act if they are, and I quote, worthy of respect in a democratic society, in that they do not infringe on the protected rights of others. So to back this up, Judge Taylor referred back to when Maya Forstater retweeted an article that said that pronouns are rohypnol. They change our perception, they lower our defences, they make us react differently, alter the reality in front of us, and argue that cis people should not respect trans people's pronouns because that is exactly the same as a drug used to rape people. Judge Taylor also pointed out that Forstater had backed Posey Parker's infamous billboard-based bullshit. One of the most interesting parts for us was when he made clear in the judgment that there is nothing to stop the claimant campaigning against the proposed revision to the Gender Recognition Act to be based more on self-identification. She is entitled to put forward her opinion that there should be some spaces that are limited to women assigned female at birth, where doing so is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. However, this does not mean that her absolutist view that sex is immutable is a protected belief for the purposes of the Equality Act. The claimant can legitimately put forward her arguments about the importance of some safe spaces that only be available to women who are identified as such at birth, without also insisting on calling trans women men. So that there is essentially Taylor saying there are ways to talk about trans issues without being an arsehole about it, which as a message is a pretty strong one and I definitely approve. So simply put then, this is a case of a bigot who made it clear that her bigoted beliefs would almost certainly result in her discriminating against trans people in her work, then not having her work contract renewed. Simple, right? Lol, no, of course not. Are you kidding? What kind of unicorn world are you living in? So, of course, the press gets involved. The Guardian immediately reported on this as Judge rules against researcher who lost job over transgender tweets, going on to state that she was accused of using offensive and exclusionary language in tweets opposing government proposals to reform the GRA and to allow people to self-identify. Which, although she absolutely did use said language, that's very much not what the judgment was about. So this idea spread around the internet like wildfire and even got to Harry Potter author JK Rowling, who used the opportunity to finally fling off the mask of decency and come on out as a full-on transphobe by tweeting, "Dress however you please, call yourself whatever you like, sleep with any consenting adult who'll have you, live your best life in peace and security, but force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real? I stand with Maya." So let me just break this down so that The Guardian and JK Rowling can understand this. Firstly, she wasn't fired. This wasn't about stating that sex was real or not, and that this was about someone who argued that a bigoted belief should be allowed to be followed absolutely, that the bigoted belief should itself be a protected characteristic alongside sex, gender, race, disability, and all the rest of it. So, what say you, fellow podcaster? That's quite a lot, right?
Well, the way I see it is that the Equality Act was faced with an attack through this. The attack was to see if anti-trans views and anti-trans actions can be put in the same category as someone being a disabled person, someone being a person of colour, someone being a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or any of the other stuff. And the Equality Act stood firm and did not crumble. That is what the story is. The Equality Act was under attack because if she was successful and this judge decided to set the precedent where a view that goes against the Equality Act in itself can be covered by the said Equality Act, this could have potentially led to the Equality Act itself crumbling in on itself in a horrible vortex of hate and horror.
Basically, because then that justifies people that say, oh no, It is my deeply held philosophical belief that black people are not worthy of respect and I don't have to hire them. It's setting that precedent. It's opening that door, right? And so people who are supporting this and then, crying after the judgment saying that it's, women's rights are under attack, it's just, you are talking out of your arse. And what's worse is you might even be doing that deliberately to mislead people. So,
and it's working. The big talking point from all of this and all across the media, and thanks to JK Rowling, it's now gone global, is that there was a woman who was fired because she tweeted that sex is real. And that's not what actually happened.
It is not. She wasn't even fired or even dismissed over this.
I first heard about this, I think, at the beginning of 2019, and it was one of the things that I saw being reported for a couple of days, but I remember deciding not to put it in the show at the time because I thought there is no way this is going to go anywhere. When I saw the crowdfunder, it was like up to a piddling amount.
Yes.
And I was like, there's no way in hell that they could ever win this. There is just no way in hell because the Equality Act is set up so you can't make bigoted beliefs into a protected class, because otherwise every Nazi in the UK would be like, well, being a Nazi is a protected class now, and then that would mean that being a racist shithead is a protected class now. So I just didn't see it happening. I didn't even think it was ever going to go to court. I was surprised when this came out yesterday and a little bit of the day before, because I thought that this had genuinely just vanished off the face of the earth. I thought that she must have just taken a little bit of money and just dropped it. But that wasn't the case. Turned out that...
Your optimism's adorable.
My optimism was very adorable back then. It's my innocence is now completely gnarled and been destroyed.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's okay. It needed to happen. Yeah, and people are just acting like this is a massive affront to equality, and it's like the safeguard was in place and it worked, because this would have set a very, very dangerous situation, and the people who seem to be really behind her don't give a shit about that. They're willing to burn literally anything to stop trans people from doing anything.
Pretty much, yeah. And there's some stuff in the judgment, and honestly, we would recommend reading the judgment.
Link in the description.
For a court judgment, it's in surprisingly, I guess, accessible language. I read through it easily enough and understood it. But also, it's worth pointing out that we also had the sterling work of a couple of Twitter users as well, Casey Explosion and Joss Pryor, both of whom did quite extensive, exhaustively sourced tweets about, the judgment and what it means and so on. So thank you, both of you, for assuming you're listening. But thanks both to Casey Explosion and to Joss Pryor for doing that, because that was, extremely useful, and it's a very, very good place to start. But I think just before we wrap this up, I'm going to quote slightly from the judgment, because it is just, in legal terms, it is a proper fucking beatdown. So this is specifically talking about this view that the person have that gender is absolute and that it cannot be changed. However, I consider that the claimant's view in its absolutist nature is incompatible with human dignity and fundamental rights of others. Yeah. She goes so far as to deny the right of a person with a gender recognition certificate to be the sex to which they have transitioned. I do not accept the claimant's contention that the Gender Recognition Act produces a mere legal fiction, which is a term that we've heard gender critical types use about gender recognition certificates. It provides a right based on the assessment of the various interrelated convention rights for a person to transition in certain circumstances and thereafter to be treated for all purposes as being of the sex to which they have transitioned. In Goodwin, which was the case that took place before the Gender Recognition Act was put in place, it was a court case from 2002 where the ECHR decided that actually, yes, we very much do need to have some kind of legal gender recognition process. So yes, in Goodwin, a fundamental aspect of the reasoning of the ECHR was that a person who has transitioned should not be forced to identify with their gender assigned at birth. Such a person should be entitled to live as a person of the sex to which they have transitioned. That was recognised in the Gender Recognition Act, which states that the change of sex applies for all purposes. Therefore, if a person has transitioned from male to female and has a gender recognition certificate, that person is legally a woman. That is not something that the claimant is entitled to ignore.
Yep. That gets to the heart of it.
That's precisely it. And by saying that, oh, well, it's a legal fiction. Well, no, it's not. You see, it's, that's not how that works. If it's in the law, it's legal, and that's how the process is done. And that applies to everybody, including you nasty little bigots. So, yes, annoying that this happened, but obviously the response to it and the result of it in terms of the judgment was it warmed the cockles of my blackened little heart, I must say. I think that's probably enough of that. I think let's rattle on through to the next bit of news. How about that?
Let's do some calls to action. So, in kinda slightly maybe related news from north of the wall, the Scottish Government has launched a fresh public consultation about the Gender Recognition Act. The proposal sets out a new process within the devolved Scottish Government to replace the current system in use nationally. The draft bill suggests that a more straightforward statutory declaration model could be the direction of travel, as opposed to the current system involving submission of evidence to the Gender Recognition Panel. The bill would also reduce the amount of time it takes for legal recognition from 2 years down to 6 months, and it would also lower the age requirement for the process from 18 to 16. All of that sounding better than the current system right now.
Indeed.
This actually surprised us when it was announced. As we discussed on a recent episode, there have been rumblings within the ruling Scottish National Party ranks about trans inclusion. There's been some gender-critical tomfoolery at Holyrood too, sad to say. Not least of which was an event that MSPs planned to take place on Trans Day of Remembrance in November, featuring 3 gender-critical speakers, including Sheila fucking Jeffries. Remember her? She was the one who said that trans women are parasites. After a certain amount of backlash over their choice of day, that event was postponed until the new year. But over the last few months, there have been repeated bubblings of shitty nonsense occasionally appearing in the press. All of which seems to go against what the actual population of Scotland thinks about the issue. A few weeks ago, a new poll was published showing that 38% of people in Scotland thought that the waiting time we've just mentioned should indeed be reduced from 2 years to 6 months, and the Scottish Government should have a fair amount of information about this already, given that they have already run a public consultation about the gender recognition process back in 2018. So while this draft bill is welcomed, to us it seems a little bit like putting the trans community through the mincer of press hostility for a second time, and could have been avoided given how recent the previous consultation was. It's also been pointed out that this draft bill currently contains no mechanism for the legal recognition of non-binary people, because of course it fucking doesn't. And there's still no planned recognition of any kind for those who are under 16. However, since it's a public consultation, it's a chance to get your voice heard. We've put a link in the description of where to fill in this consultation, which is open until March 2020. It doesn't just have to be trans people in Scotland responding to this, it's open to the whole UK, so go to the links sheet in the description, go click on the consultation thing and fill it out. What do you think? What do we think? What are the thinkings?
What are the thinkings? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's good and bad in this, isn't there? Because there's been kind of like back and forth, as we talked about on the Manifestos episode of the podcast. The SNP had a very strong kind of LGBT offer within the manifesto in 2017, but that had all seemingly been dropped from the manifesto itself for 2019, which we spoke about. But at the same time, Scotland has for quite a while, really, particularly in terms of the actual groups that work there, like the Scottish Trans Alliance, has kind of led the way, really, because in terms of devolving how certain things like healthcare works and kind of actually pushing through for this gender recognition in a way that the UK government are not doing. But it, so that's good. And the fact that they're kind of moving the process forward in the face of a certain amount of opposition from within the party is good and is a good sign. But again, a public consultation. That data is still relatively fresh, I would say. Why is there a need to do it again? I think. And there's that, that quote, which I keep coming back to because it just keeps coming up, about how the rights of the minority should never be subordinate to the whims of the majority, which a public consultation is doing that. It's basically saying, hey, fellow citizens, tell us what you think about this particular group of citizens. Should we give them rights or not? And it's like, actually, maybe that's not the best way to do that. I'm disappointed that it doesn't contain anything for recognition of non-binary people. I'm disappointed that it doesn't really contain anything talking about trans youngsters who may be very, very clear on who they are and what they want to be with their lives and so on by the time that they are 16. I think there's a certain case to be made for some manner of legal recognition starting younger than that, but maybe we're not ready for that conversation either. So yeah, this is good, but also it's like, why are you doing it like this? kind of thing. I don't know. What do you think?
I think this is basically about making it appear that the Scottish government are listening to all groups concerned. I think that this is a sign that the Scottish National Party, at the very least in Holyrood, I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be the case with the SNP MPs in Westminster, but this is definitely the case in Holyrood, where they are putting anti-trans bigots on equal footing with trans people, which I think is what this consultation is about. I think that there's been a lot of calls for this so they could say that they have listened to everyone, and I think this is something that we're going to have to get used to from cis politicians, at least for the time being. We should, of course, keep the fights up, but we should expect politicians all over the place in all the countries of the United Kingdom to give the floor to bigots over this, because in their mind, right now, bigotry is an acceptable part of the discourse. That is something that I think trans people and non-binary people should be working to change as fast as possible, and are doing and will continue to do, and have been doing amazing work there with all the groups that I've been sort of following over the last couple of years. But I think that's the reality of the situation. Right now, cis people are willing to give bigots at the very least equal time, and maybe even more time than us. And I think that's entirely what the second consultation is about.
I think you might be right there.
Either way, they aren't going to do the right thing if you don't write in. So this consultation is open to everyone in the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Wales, England, Scotland. We are all able to submit. You don't have to live in Scotland, so go and do it. Go and put into your consultation response recognition for non-binary people, recognition for trans kids under the age of 16. Remember, this is not about healthcare. Specifically, healthcare is a whole other thing. This is about legal recognition. So legal recognition for kids under 16 is not the same as demanding that 4-year-olds get hormone injections in their ass in the GP's office after one 5-minute conversation. Something that doesn't ever fucking happen anyway. But just so you know, this is not about the validity of medicating young trans kids. This is about recognizing them as a basic thing.
Well, and you know, recognizing trans adults and making the system easier for people to actually navigate and utilize without being thoroughly dehumanized by it. But now, for some more cheerful fun times, we've got some amazing news, haven't we?
Now some awesome news to wash down the weird. Budapest was the location for Hungary's first trans pride earlier this month.
Woo!
The pride was organised as a protest, like pride should be, in response to the Hungarian government withholding the evaluations of requests to change a person's legal gender. Last year, Hungary formally allowed their citizens to change their legal gender as long as they had a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. But they do not have to have hormones or surgery to be able to change their legal gender. But thus far, by the sounds of it, nobody has received their evaluations, and so protest trans pride happened. This is amazing because Hungary is pretty sketchy about LGBT people in general. Equal marriage is constitutionally barred, but discrimination protections for LGBT people are in place. Basically, Hungary is so mixed and so divided on this stuff that marching is brave as hell. Hungary has had some issues with far-right groups openly marching and all of that. Hungary has had a particularly turbulent couple of decades when it comes to their politics, including a very limited period at the beginning of this decade where they technically weren't a democracy anymore for a bit. Like, their government has been all over the place, and with public perceptions in Hungary being so varied, it is just brave to just walk out the house and join up with a bunch of trans people and get your bellowing on. So, congrats to Trans Pride Budapest, and good luck in the fights to come.
Yeah, abso-heckin-lutely. Congratulations to Trans Pride Budapest and the LGBT community of Hungary. What's next?
Now we go to Asia. We go to Japan, where a fight has been won. A Japanese trans woman who works for the government has won her court battle over her right to use the women's toilets. Where, hey...
Woo!
In the case, Judge Kenji Ebara awarded the unnamed trans woman 1.32 million yen, which shakes out to a little under £10,000, and demanded that the trans woman be allowed to access any woman's toilet where she works, whilst also never having to disclose her trans status. Ebara justified the ruling by saying that banning the trans women from women's toilets was illegal because it, and I quote, constrains people's benefits of living their lives in accordance with their self-identified genders. This enshrines in law by court precedent that it is illegal for employers to require surgery for them to respect trans identities. So, well fucking done to that Japanese trans woman, whoever she is.
Absolutely. I take it she wasn't named in the case for legal reasons, or... She wanted to stay.
I'm not entirely
name out of it.
sure. It wasn't really that widely reported, at least in Western presses. I got this from one story from LGBTQnation.com. We'll provide a link in the description so you can read it for yourself. And she wasn't named in that. But this small victory right here will have widespread repercussions on every trans person working in Japan, which is a damned good thing.
It certainly is. Sorry, that was a bit Laurel and Hardy, wasn't it? It certainly is. So, yeah, fantastic.
So now you are more aware of what is going on in the world. We are going to move along to the meat, which we have called between ourselves, what the fuck are the Tories going to do to us?
Yeah, it's on brand.
It's definitely on brand. And to help us dig through all of this horrible post-election nonsense, we have the wonderful Vic Parsons, Pink News gender and identity reporter. Vic, how is it going?
It's going good. Thanks for having me on today.
Lovely to have you on. Thank you for joining us, bright and early as it is.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever recorded an episode this early before. We're actually recording this on the same day of releasing it, which we haven't done before, I don't think. This is all new.
Well, I feel honoured to be your earliest.
Earliest bird, yes. And I think the reason that we've asked Vic along to talk to us today is because I know just from my life that there are a lot of people a little bit concerned about all the stuff that happens next. And I don't think that's unreasonable, really, given that the government haven't really been terribly helpful on trans issues in its preceding incarnation. It may be slightly different now that they have a majority, but perhaps not. So, Vic, to just throw straight to you, what's your main concern at this point about the trans community under this government?
My main concern is not particularly limited to the trans community. I think that the things that the Tories are sort of infamous for, like austerity and cuts to public services and, you know, this threat of privatizing the NHS, they're things that affect everyone, but they're also things that impact the trans community perhaps more, perhaps because people need to get healthcare from a gender identity clinic, or, you know, we're like overly represented as a community among like the homeless population or the sex working community. And so Tory policies that affect everyone might like disproportionately affect trans people, I guess, is my main concern, is just general Tory dread exacerbated for like people who are more marginalized.
You're absolutely right, because it's a bit difficult to kind of know how to feel about it, because things are just kind of uncertain but looking kind of bad. So, I mean, we can try and make a couple of inferences, but that's not really being helped out by stuff that the government is or isn't saying or seemingly contradicting itself on. So, not long ago, it was actually pretty widely reported that there was a new Minister for Women and Equalities. So it announced that Theresa Coffey was going to be doing that, but then that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, so I think you're right in that uncertainty is the most worrying things. For example, like I think in the Conservatives manifesto, they had 2 mentions of LGBT people, and they didn't have reforming the Gender Recognition Act in their manifesto. So I think it's a case of like, we don't know what's coming. And in terms of like Theresa Coffey, I think it was basically misreported by the BBC in one piece. And you saw how quickly that spread. And obviously she doesn't have a very good record on gay rights and equal marriage. And everyone was immediately extremely concerned. And that's the kind of thing that, you know, could just happen. Like this party have a majority and they have a lot of people in their party who are not the strongest LGBT allies. So we're right to be really concerned about stuff like that happening. I mean, fortunately, that was just the BBC made an error and it traveled. It took, you know, a phone call to the Government Equalities Office and they were like, no, where it's coming from, the press is still in post, nothing has changed.
We're very aware of the whole calling up the government or government department and realising that half of the media are full of shit. We've done that a couple of times on this show ourselves. It's just so strange. There's so many people out there in like the mainstream who aren't making the phone calls that take like 2 minutes. It's so strange.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a journalist who functions as part of the media, I'd like to try and defend people on, we're all really time poor and we have to do more work, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, there's not really any excuse for not picking up the phone and information. Like it takes 2 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that always seemed like a really good starting point, at least try and get in touch with someone to just double check the veracity of whatever it is that's being claimed or released. So
yeah. Yeah, some facts are good.
Facts are brilliant, aren't they? And none of the sort of, alternative facts either. We're not interested.
So, talking about the Women and Equalities brief, I mean, the main concern I have is that there is a chance that the Government Equalities Office and the Minister for Women and Equalities position is going to change radically, and I got that from Liz Truss, who is currently the Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, I think.
Yeah.
It's still her name on the government website, so I don't know if that's likely to change. There's been a reshuffle recently. There's going to be another reshuffle after Brexit gets done. Ha ha.
Yeah.
They're going to be cutting the cabinet posts to 16 from 21. It's not been reported which particular positions those may be, although it's been speculated that the Brexit-related positions will be cut and all of the international trade-related ministries will come under one thing, which is more than likely going to come under Liz Truss because trade's sort of her big thing. That's her other brief as a minister.
Yeah, that's her famous "we import too much cheese" brief.
Yeah.
Right?
Was it cheese or was it pears?
Oh, pears? I'm not sure, but it was just great. Whatever it is.
It might have been both,
Can you have too much cheese?
Well, I mean, that's the real question, isn't it? So,
right, this is a cheese podcast now. This is what we're talking about for the next 45 minutes.
What the cheese? Okay,
what the cheese? That's what we're called now. But yeah, Liz Truss was reportedly given the brief for Women and Equalities by Dominic Cummings in an attempt to strangle GRA reform. That came from the Daily Mail earlier, a few months back. That came from an unnamed Downing Street source, which I'm sure you are very familiar with unnamed Downing Street sources at this point, Vic.
Yeah, love it when they're senior too.
Oh, fantastic.
I think that with Liz Truss, I mean, she said, didn't she, that she wants to rename it is it the Ministry of Freedom or Truth or something terrifying?
Ministry of Freedom, yeah, which is...
So I think I have the quote here. No one wants to be the token woman. You don't want to feel like you've been appointed to a job because you've got boobs. We need to reassert the value of individual and character above the particular type of group you might happen to be a member of. And she went on to talk about the department maybe should be renamed the Ministry of Freedom, as it should be about freedom for people to do what they want and not having a focus on identity politics, in her words. And she said that too much ground has been conceded to the left in regards to identity politics. So what I took from all of that is that she was basically saying what the left do is that they say, right, you're a woman, you're a black person, you're a disabled person, you get this job because of those things. And being good at the job is no longer a thing for us, which is a gross fucking misrepresentation of what the left-wing position on that situation is, I think. What do you think?
I don't really know where to begin with that. I think that Liz Truss has just been a worrying person in that post since the beginning, and using phrases like, identity politics of the left and criticizing kind of like the concept of hiring more diverse workforces is, alarm bells ringing, right? But I think going back to what you said earlier in terms of what does this all mean for the trans community, until they've got Brexit done, then I just don't think that we'll really know. I don't think that they're, if I was to sort of wildly speculate about what our senior politicians are thinking about at the moment, like, I don't think that trans issues are really on their radar at all. I think it's just Brexit focused. And I think that, we're right to be concerned and alarmed. But at this point, it's just, like you said earlier, we're just speculating about what could happen. I don't think we'll start seeing it for a while.
That's kind of part of the worry, for me at least, is that, something's announced. It's like, well, it's too late to do anything about it. And that's just kind of the way it is for however many years until repeal or something. I think a lot of people are quite concerned about something like a new Section 28. like an anti-identity politics law. But I just keep coming back to Ministry of Freedom. And since I heard that phrase, there's been this high-pitched whine taking place, which I talked to some seismologists, and it turns out that it's George Orwell spinning in his grave several thousand times a second.
Yeah, I mean, that's literally in the book, right? That's
yes.
Literally in the book. What the fuck, Truss? What the fuck?
It's not supposed to be an instruction manual. You see this a lot from, and I kind of hate to, make myself so clearly left-wing, but a lot of the right-wing stuff is about kind of a language game. And so they're talking about identity politics, but they're not necessarily using that term in the same way that other people would. They're kind of trying to deliberately misrepresent what that exactly means. And this is a classic trick, and we see it specifically in a lot of the transphobia that we see in the press, where the Gender Recognition Act is misrepresented, and so is the concept of self-declaration and saying that, this will mean this, and that's actually not it at all. They're just essentially creating a false narrative.
Much like they just did with all of this court case business and with JK coming in and all of that stuff. They're doing it again right now.
Yeah, that's one of the most frustrating things, right? I mean, I think you must both find this as well. I mean, your podcast is one of the places that has the facts and the trans people talking about the facts, but so much of the media is cis journalists, cis straight old journalists, just kind of creating this narrative around what GRA reform is, or what, yesterday with the court case. And it's not actually what's happening. And it's just so frustrating to watch people get really, upset, people sort of who might be on the right or more gender critical, getting really upset about something that, they're not right to be upset about it anyway, but they're also upset about something that isn't even happening or being suggested. It's I find it very frustrating. I expect that's a shared sentiment.
Frustrating is a nice way of putting it. Yesterday I was in the foulest fucking mood, looking around, seeing loads of people saying, "Oh, this woman got fired from her job for saying a thing," and it's like,
no, she didn't.
Not what happened. She wasn't even fucking fired. That's the bare minimum of the thing.
And by all accounts, she wasn't very good at her job anyway. So R.I.P.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's if you're gonna do that sort of thing, you kind of want to make sure that everything else is sort of perfect, so they can say, yeah, but I've done such a fantastic job, you just have to keep me on. And actually,
it just feeds back into how a lot of people think that trans people sort of are easily offended or get upset over nothing and stuff. There's something about the whole situation that feels a bit fever dreamish to me, to be honest.
Going back to Section 28, there's one thing that came up when Liz Truss was talking to Julia Hartley-Brewer on Talk Radio that I didn't see reported in many other places, that caused me a little alarm, where she sort of pivoted when talking about GRA reform to talking about trans kids and the importance, and she also made a big song and dance of protecting single-sex spaces, which, great connotation there that single-sex spaces need to be protected from trans people. Awesome, thanks, Minister for Women and Equalities. But she went on to then she pivoted almost immediately to how adults should be able to make their decision, but should be able to make the decision, but children shouldn't be protected. And that was concerning to me, because the conversation was about GRA reform, but wasn't ostensibly about transgender children. And she pivoted from one to the other almost immediately, which lines up with what the Daily Mirror reporting when they said that Dominic Cummings gave her the job because of her anti-trans kids views. So I think I would not be surprised if at some point Liz Truss tried to introduce some kind of policy or some kind of law that would make it harder for trans kids to seek the care they get, under the false assumption that there's people just injecting hormones into 4-year-olds all over the country.
Yeah, that's very much not how it works. And so I think this kind of chimes in with what you were saying, Vic, about kind of feeling like in some kind of mirror universe, because the stuff that we read in the papers and, hostile press, whatever, is that trans children are railroaded through the system and it happens lightning quickly, and it's like they're making irreversible decisions on the snap of a fingers. When we know as trans people who have accessed that system and have known people who have accessed that system and indeed have done a bunch of stuff working within that system to try and reform it, we know that it is agonizingly slow, and it is terrifyingly uncertain and arbitrary and inconsistent depending on where you are in the country. And so to read that there's this kind of organized trans cabal handing out blockers and hormones like fucking Skittles to all the children is like, what? It is so far removed from reality. It's difficult to know how to counter it. It's like wrong on every single level in every single one of its assumptions. And so to try and counter that is to sit there for 20 minutes and say, okay, this is wrong because of this. This is wrong because of this. This is an unfounded assumption because of this. And no one's interested in that. No one's interested in that refutation. Everybody just wants to, I've heard it referred to as a gish gallop, where you just kind of put out so much misinformation in a single paragraph. By the time it's all been refuted, the news cycle's moved on. Yeah.
And I think you're right. Like, not knowing how to counter what's coming is the scariest part, right? Because I know that any policies that she comes up with around trans kids, if there's a policy that says, people under the age of 14 can't access hormones, then we know that actually doesn't affect anyone, right? Because no one that age is being given hormones anyway. But what it does is create this big kind of media whirlwind of the children are being given hormones, blah, blah, blah. So how do you counter something where what the changes that they might want to make might not actually have any effect, but the effect is as in not have any effect on 14-year-olds accessing hormones, because 14-year-olds don't access hormones anyway, but the effect is again on public perception of trans people, and then making it easier to push through different policies on trans people that would be more threatening, but we just don't know which direction they're going to come from and what they're going to be about. And like you say, countering misinformation in the press is, God, it just feels like you must feel this with your podcast as well. And I definitely feel this at Pink News. There need to be 100 of me and 100 of you and 100 of all the other trans journalists before we can even start to make a dent in the news cycle that is filled by cis journalists, many of whom don't have a clue about trans stuff.
Do you think that the sloppiness of a lot of the mainstream media on trans issues is due to current pressures on journalists in the sector anyway, with time and stuff? Or do you think there is a anti-trans agenda out there? Or do you think there's a weird combination of both, sort of feeding a sort of Ouroboros of nightmarish horrors being unleashed from them? What's your take on the situation?
I don't think it's binary. I think it's both and situations. So I think that there are definitely some papers for sure that have more of an anti-trans angle. I'm sure I don't need to name them for you.
Can't think of who you mean just at the moment. It's
maybe wait till Sunday.
Yeah, then I can take my pick, can't I?
But yeah, I think that there are definitely papers that have more of a set angle.
Definitely.
But then within all media organizations, there'll be journalists are people as well, and journalists have their own views, and I think objectivity is something to be aimed for, and then it also depends who those journalists, so sort of on an institutional level, I think it's fair to say that the mainstream media is institutionally transphobic, and then on an individual level, there'll be journalists who have trans friends or queer friends who might have a different sort of base level knowledge of these issues by having those friends, and then there'll be people who have never met a trans person. And then of that group of people, maybe some of them might have been briefed by All About Trans coming into their office, or Gendered Intelligence doing a lunchtime session, or they might have had Women's Place come in to do a session, which is an anti-trans group. And it just, of the people who sort of aren't connected to the community and don't really have views, it's sort of, maybe it then depends on who they've been, told, who's been telling them, kind of thing. I think it's hard to there's not one problem with the way that the media reports on trans issues, but as I say really often on Twitter, hire more trans journalists, hire more queer journalists, to hire more working class trans journalists and trans journalists of color. And the way to change it, in my opinion, is to have more of us in the room.
Yeah, with all of the stuff in the media about trans and non-binary stuff going on, it's Not too much to ask that there be like one trans non-binary journalist in the room, at least in every newsroom at this point, because everyone keeps insisting on talking about it. I mean, I thought that would be the bare minimum of what someone should do, but I'm a wishy-washy DIY podcaster person, so what do I know?
And also, I think that it's different for like a news reporter or a features writer. Like a news reporter might cover so many different things, and you can't expect them to A, be trans, or B, know about trans issues. You just hope that they're objective. But when it comes to columnists and opinion writers, I feel quite strongly that, you know, if you're writing an opinion piece on trans issues, you need to be at least queer, if not trans, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, I think the days of having cishet people write their opinions on trans rights should be, I mean, over like ASAP.
Yeah.
It fits with what a lot of people have been calling for much longer than I've been a journalist, which is newsrooms need to be more diverse anyway. Yep. Newsrooms are made up of white middle class people like me, and you know that means that what gets covered and how it gets covered in terms of general news reporting doesn't reflect the country, and so I think it's not just more trans news reporters we need, but like I said earlier, it's more news reporters who don't look like me, who aren't white, middle class, etc., able-bodied, privately educated. Like newsrooms need to be more diverse, like full stop. I
mean, that'd be good, wouldn't it? Gosh, what a world that could be. The patriarchy's still in charge of the newsroom, we knew that. But even though there's, you know, perhaps a commitment from a newsroom or a political organisation, say, oh, yes, no, we're absolutely committed to diversity. And then you take a look at one of their press shots and it is just white people. And it's like, you know, you guys are based in London. How did you even manage that? But then, you know, who is, for a diversity thing for an organisation like broadsheet newspaper, when they say, oh yeah, we're committed to diversity, but you know, in what way are you doing that, and who is deciding how that is measured? You know, because if they are setting their own standards, then it's quite easy to adhere to. That's how it seems to the outsider, particularly to the very, very cynical, bitter outsider who lives in the north.
I'm not going to be able to remember the name of it right now, but I think there was a study done that found that, because obviously newsrooms also used to be predominantly men. And I think, don't quote me on this. I'm aware that it's a podcast, so it is being quoted. But basically, when you hire more women, when there was a push to get more women into newsrooms, they found that women were more likely to hire other women and other minorities. And I think it's that kind of like systemic slow change, unfortunately. Yeah, the people doing the hiring, the people deciding the diversity quotas, and the people deciding what diversity looks like need to not be men. And that will, happens real slow, frustratingly.
Yeah, when it comes to certain government departments and the PM and the cabinet and all of that stuff, the government, for quotes, we found that at times this has not been helpful, as in we put a lot of effort and work into chasing these quotes, and we've either get the same old fucking press release about GRA reform happening in due course and all of that stuff, and Boris Johnson is a racist and a liar. That's what he is. As a journalist, do you think there's any point in us going forward trying to get official responses from the government? Because we have said that we're probably not going to bother anymore, but now that we've got 5 years of this lot, we don't know whether to just completely make it a policy or just to keep trying and getting the same old shit. What do you think?
I think, I'm not sure about you two as a weekly podcast, because it's a sort of the time, what's it called? Cost-benefit ratio seems like it's probably a bit off. I mean, for me, working at Pink News, there's always use in that, because even if you get, the kind of the official party line and you don't get anything more than that, that's still something that you can hold people to. So we saw last summer, I think it was Penny Mordaunt at the Pink News summer reception at Westminster said, just in a sort of vox pop with a colleague of mine, oh yeah, we're going to get GRA reform published in the next couple of weeks. And, so we did a story on that. So then when Theresa May was about to leave office, I phoned up the GEO and said, hey, Penny said that you were going to do this before Theresa left. Theresa's leaving in 3 days. What's going on? And it just gives you a little bit of leverage and a little bit of like being able to hold individual politicians or government officers to account. But in terms of like, the amount of time that you put in and the kind of like the uselessness of the information that you might get back, I can see how that would seem slightly pointless. I mean, I guess it depends what your aim is with getting that information. And I mean, the government won't tell you anything unless it wants to tell you something, right? So if you're one of the people who keeps asking, then maybe you'll be the person who, you'll be, you know, when they decide to tell people stuff, they'll tell you as well. But
I don't ever think that we will be part of the government strategy when it comes to getting the word out there about trans and non-binary stuff. That I would love it if they kept us in their strategy. But when it comes to our specific outlet,
me neither. But I guess what I mean is that if you're someone that the press office of a particular place is kind of familiar with calling up, then you can you just become your organization feels like a familiar name. Like, I'm sure the GO at this point are they hear the word Pink News from me or one of my colleagues. You know, Pink News has been going a long time now, and there's like a level of attention that they'll give you that they wouldn't do if it was Joe Bloggs's website. But I think there is a point in calling up the government. I think that we have to hold them, as journalists, we have to hold them for account and and that involves playing the game of phoning them up and asking their opinions and sending questions. But that doesn't mean that the game itself isn't flawed deeply.
Game of phones. Sorry, that was rubbish, but
game of phones. No, that's staying in.
Woo!
I'm not cutting that. Even if you want it to cut, it's staying in.
Damn it! This is the problem with entrusting all the editing to you. We're going to have to wrap this up now, unfortunately, but just as a last question, what advice would you give to trans people who might be worried at the moment?
Your worry is valid, and I think find your community, find your people who are also worried and angry. And I think that, as has been flying around on social media since the election result, the best thing to do in a situation like this is to take action, to help at your local food bank or join an activist group, demonstrate, protest, write your MP, etc. And find your people who can, be with you in that feeling of anger and worry and fear, and be safe.
Yeah, be queer, do crime, form a coven. It's
Be gay, do crime.
Yeah.
I was hoping we'd get through one episode of the show without Ashley outright calling for our listeners to do something illegal. I was hoping for one episode.
Forming a coven's not illegal. Anyway, so that about wraps it up for this jolly little episode of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you so much, Vic, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And you can find us on the social medias, which are...
You can get us on Facebook, facebook.com/whatthetrans. You can get us on Twitter, @whatthetrans. You can get us on our website, which is our website for now, but in the new year we'll have a whole new one. But for now, our website is whatthetranspod.tumblr.com. Vic, where can people find you and your work and words?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram @Vic Parsons with an underscore on the end. And I write for Pink News, so if you go to Pink News and search my name, you will find everything.
And for the record, Vic has been killing it at Pink News. I've been very much enjoying their coverage, because you put a bit of sass in your reports, which I am a big fan of.
Yeah, we're here for sass.
Thanks.
So catch up with all of Vic's stuff wherever it ends up, and check out their work on Pink News, because again, lots of sass, lots of facts. We are fans. Our next proper episode will be out on the 10th of January. We're going to take 2 weeks to eat lots of things and lie down and watch lots of terrible TV and do all the other Christmas things. But we will have a Christmas speech available on Christmas Day itself. Me and Ashley will come together and talk for 10 minutes and say some lovely things, because you could watch the Queen speech, or you can watch the Queen's speech.
Yeah.
Well, listen to anyway.
Listen to it, and just have a picture of us or something. Anyway,
yes.
Happy holidays to all of you, and to you too, Michelle and Vic, and look after yourselves. over the festive period, and everybody stay safe and sane and be lovely to each other, and we will see you for our next proper episode next year.
Yes, happy 2019 ending time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.